Hello, and welcome to our webinar, the U.S. Spanish language translation of the MMPI-3, an overview. I'm Yossef Ben-Porath from Kent State University, and I'll be presenting along with Antonio Puente from UNC Wilmington for today's webinar. In terms of disclosures, before we begin with the substance of the webinar today, I am a paid consultant to the MMPI publisher, the University of Minnesota Press, and distributor Pearson, and I receive research funding from the University of Minnesota Press. As co-author of the MMPI-2RF and MMPI-3, I receive royalties on sales of test materials and scorings. Dr. Puente served as a consultant to the University of Minnesota Press on the Spanish language translation of the MMPI-3. Our agenda for today's webinar, Dr. Puente will get us started going over the assessment of Spanish speakers in the United States. I'll then talk a little bit about the history of Spanish translations of the MMPI instruments, and then turn to an overview of the MMPI-3, the Spanish translation of the MMPI-3. Dr. Puente will return and talk about the translation process, and then I'll go over the norms and findings, and Dr. Puente will then wrap things up with some best practices for administration, scoring, and interpretation of the Spanish language version of the MMPI-3. And with that, I'll turn things over to Dr. Puente, who will go over assessing Spanish speakers in the U.S.
Thank you. Great opportunity to be with you today. One of the things that's been surprising in the development of tests for individuals residing in the United States is that over the last several decades, a large percentage of those of us in the practice world have discovered that an increasing percentage of the demographics of our country happen to be individuals that just don't fit the standard testing practices that we all have become accustomed to. And as a consequence, we discovered that what we had been doing just did not match what we needed to do. And this particular situation we're going to be describing today is, first of all, discussing the situation that we find ourselves in the U.S. with regards to assessing Spanish speakers. As part of the Committee for the Standards for Educational Psychological Tests that was published in 2014, we focus a great deal on making sure that the tests that were available in the United States, and for that matter, the rest of the world, did take into consideration individuals that were not from the majority group. And one of the things that was particularly challenging to us was trying to figure out how was it that what we were doing would be applicable to all individuals, not just some individuals. And the reconfiguration, not only of our thinking, but of the actual manual itself, came to fruition when we decided that we were going to add as one of the core chapters, besides validity and reliability, the third chapter, which is called fairness. Fairness is defined as a test that is fair, does not unduly advantage or disadvantage certain examinees because of individual characteristics that are irrelevant to the construct being measured. In other words, the idea is that we do not measure anything but the construct. Otherwise, we're measuring error. And this complicates the entire situation. So if we take a look at Chapter 3, and the main standard is as follows: all steps in the testing process, including the test design, validation, development, administration, and scoring procedures, should be designed in a manner as to minimize construct irrelevant variance and to promote valid score interpretations for the intended use for all examinees in the intended population. In other words, making sure that we had a clear knowledge of what the construct was that we were trying to measure, and then making sure that anything that was not associated with that construct was not being measured. So with that in mind, we go into the specific clusters, if you will, sort of the digging deep into the standard that we call fairness. Test design, develop, administration, scoring procedures that minimize barriers to valid score interpretations for the widest possible range of individuals and relevant subgroups. In other words, not just the idea, but the entire aspect, including the administration scoring, the validity of test score interpretations for intended uses for the intended examinee population. In this case, Spanish speakers. Accommodations, not modifications. That's an entirely different thing. Accommodation to remove construct, irrelevant barrier, and support valid interpretation of scores for their intended use. Our goal is to safeguard against inappropriate score interpretations for intended use. So our goal here is very simply making sure that our tests were fair and applied all aspects to the best psychometric concepts known to us at the time of the development of the test. In essence, what it really comes down to is very simple. We wanted to define testing equity in the following way. Reliability and validity, clearly important, but fairness is applied validity. And we wanted to make sure that fairness is operationally defined as limiting construct irrelevance. How is it, in the case of Spanish speakers, that we are measuring the construct, for example, intelligence or psychopathology, and not the misunderstanding of the culture in question? So, when it gets down to business, here are some of the challenges that we have to be really concerned about as we move forward in this very, very challenging and increasingly important demographic shift that's occurring in our country. So here are some of the theoretical issues in Spanish speakers. We want to make sure that we do not confound cultural knowledge with psychological construct. For example, we want to make sure that we ask the right questions that specifically make sure that the individual taking the exam understands the construct that we're trying to pursue and the test does not complicate it. One of the difficulties, as we'll discuss today, is that even simple words like bus have so many different meanings and so many different words in the Spanish language. What happens then, eventually, is that measurement error that is due to measuring cultural information and not psychological construct becomes the psychological construct. So in other words, if the person doesn't know what they're being asked, what we may end up finding is that we're measuring error and not what we're intending to question. And one of the difficulties is that very often we find ourselves that people are doing what we call customizable translation. They're kind of doing their own thing. They're translating on the fly, or they're doing their very best. After all, I have the patient in front of me. I've got tests in English. I've got to get the information. And what we're doing is we're translating, in some cases, literally, not cognitively. And as a consequence, what we find is that the translation is actually downright incorrect. What we're really focusing on here is we don't want just a translation. What we actually want is an adaptation, that we make sure that we understand what the construct is, and we find the right words, the right phrases, the right tone to make sure that we get the right question asked. Because otherwise, we're going to alter the test. Our goal is to make sure that when it's all said and done, what we've done is we have not changed the construct. We just adapted the test to that person, to that speaker, to make sure that we haven't modified the concept. As soon as we modify the concept, which is what many of us are doing, especially when we're doing our own translations on the fly, it gets messy. very messy. And finally, one of the challenges that we had when we started doing this revision of the standards is that back in 1999 and the first 4 other versions of the standards essentially were focused on, well, I should tell you that before the 1999, we didn't even think about linguistic translations. But in 1999, we just thought if we just simply translated the word correctly, we were all set, maybe even the concept correctly. It turns out that it's much more complicated, that we really have to define linguistic variables as well as cultural variables. And sometimes recent research has shown us that cultural variables turn out to be even more powerful than linguistic variables. Concepts such as time, such as rapport, which are often considered to be less important in certain cultures, turn out to be extremely important in the Spanish culture. For example, in the case of time, time for us is not something we conquer, it's something that we enjoy. So how is it that we do a deep dive to understand the people that we're seeking to test correctly? That's the goal of addressing this increasingly large and important segment of our community. So with that basic foundation, now I'm going to turn it over back to my colleague. Yossi?
Thank you, Tony. And I'm going to pick up here with a little bit of a brief history of the translations of the MMPI instruments into Spanish. In fact, Spanish translations of the MMPI appeared not too long after the instrument was first introduced in the 1940s. But because there were back then not as many Spanish speakers in the U.S. as we have today, those early efforts occurred outside the United States. In fact, in 1951, a Cuban psychologist by the name of Del Risco worked with Stark Hathaway, the developer of the original MMPI, and produced the very first Spanish language translation of the instrument that was used in Cuba. In 1960s, Rafael Nunez from Mexico, also working with Stark Hathaway, developed and worked to develop a Spanish translation for use in Mexico, for a Spanish translation of the MMPI. The Spanish translations in the U.S., the very first of these, was introduced in 1983, again for the original MMPI, and it was developed by Garcia and colleagues. And then when the MMPI-2 was released in the late 1980s, in 1993, the very first U.S. Spanish translation of the MMPI-2 appeared in the literature, and that was the one done by Garcia and Azan, and that remains the Spanish language for U.S. translation of the MMPI-2 that's in use today in the United States. The MMPI-2RF, of course, is made up of a subset of MMPI-2 items, and so the Garcia-Azan translation of the MMPI-2 also served as the foundation for the Spanish language version of the MMPI-2RF that you see in this slide. There also were separate translations, Spanish language translations of the restructured form done in Spain and in Mexico. So we have presently 3 Spanish translations of the MMPI-2RF in the United States, in the world, throughout the world, including the one that's used in the U.S. Now, the one in Spain and the one in Mexico both have local Spanish language norms. The Spanish language translations in the United States traditionally did not have Spanish language norms. The U.S. English language norms were used with the Spanish language translations in the United States. And one of our goals for the MMPI-3 was to actually, in addition to having a Spanish language translation of the test, also collect Spanish language norms for the MMPI-3 for use in the United States. So I'm going to turn next to a brief overview of the MMPI-3 itself, and for anyone interested in more detail, we do have webinars and other training opportunities available to learn about the MMPI-3. But in terms of our goals for the MMPI-3, there were two primary goals. One was to expand the content coverage of the restructured form, the MMPI-2RF, which of course was constrained by the MMPI-2 item pool, and there were some domains that were not at all represented in the MMPI-2 item pool, such as disordered eating, others that were not adequately represented in that item pool. The example we see here listed is grandiosity. And so our goal for the MMPI-3 was to expand the coverage of the test to areas that were not sufficiently covered or not at all represented in the item pool. And then the second primary goal, of course, was to collect new norms. The MMPI-2RF norms are the MMPI-2 norms. Those were collected in the mid-1980s, so they're more than 30 years old now. And so we wanted to collect a new up-to-date English language normative sample that would represent the current demographic makeup of the adult population of the United States, which has changed quite a bit since the mid-1980s. And as I just mentioned, also for the first time, have separate Spanish language norms for the MMPI-3. In terms of the plan for developing the MMPI-3, we used an expanded version of the MMPI-2RF called the MMPI-2RF-EX, which stands for expanded, that had first a brief biographical questionnaire that allowed us to collect historical and demographic information about the individuals who were tested for the development of the MMPI-3. That was followed by the 338 MMPI-2RF items, 43 of which were updated to simplify some of the language in the MMPI-2 item pool, and then 95 trial items. These were the items that we wrote for the MMPI-3 in order to expand the coverage of the instrument. Of course, we also had a booklet and an answer sheet that could be used to administer the test. And importantly, Pearson developed a separate standalone version of their QLocal software called QLocal EX that we were able to provide to our field data collection sites. And the importance there is that psychologists were able to use the expanded booklet in actual applied assessments, whether in mental health settings or medical or forensic or public safety candidate assessment, for example, score the MMPI-2RF, but also collect all of the data that would allow us later to score the MMPI-3. And so this expanded booklet was administered, and we'll see in a moment a list of the different types of sites where it was administered, but again, importantly, in actual applied assessments. And then all of the material for the expanded booklet was translated into Spanish. Now, the starting point here was the Garcia-Azan MMPI-2, MMPI-2RF translation. So all of those items were carried over, except for the updated items. All of the rewritten, the 43 rewritten items, and the new items were translated by Dr. Puente and his team at UNC Wilmington. Dr. Puente will describe this process here for us shortly. But that was a very important part of the development plan. In terms of field data collection that I just mentioned, data were collected at various sites representing settings where the MMPI-3 or the MMPI instruments, I should say, have traditionally been used, the ones that I just mentioned. Some of the data from the field were used for scale development, other data sets for validation, and still others, or all of them actually, were used for developing comparison groups. We also collected some fairly extensive college student data that were used for some initial psychometric analyses, as well as some detailed validation analyses. And then the normative data that were collected in English, Spanish, as well as a bilingual Spanish, English speaking sample for the normative data collection. Altogether, we collected from the field over 16,000 protocols. You see a list here of the various settings in which these protocols were collected. Roughly 8,000 individuals were tested in the various college settings where data were collected. And then for the normative data collection, we tested over 2,300 individuals in English. 280 of those came back for a week later for a retest session. 664 individuals were tested in Spanish. 60 of those individuals came back for retest for the purpose of test-retest reliability analyses. And then there were 45 individuals in the bilingual group. Altogether, over 28,000 individuals were tested as part of the MMPI-3 development process. The process itself, in terms of the actual development, we used the field data to first shorten some of the restructured clinical scales and lengthen some of the specific problem scales, and also expand the scope of those scales with some of the new items. We then updated the higher order and the Psy-5 scales, as well as the validity scales. And a very important step in the development process was that any rewritten or new item that was a candidate for inclusion on the MMPI-3 had to work in Spanish, in addition to, psychometrically that is, in addition to being selected because it worked well in English. So all of the rewritten and new items that were candidates for inclusion on the MMPI-3 were analyzed with our Spanish speaking normative and bilingual samples. And one of the items did not work properly with those groups, and so it was not included on the final version of the MMPI-3, meaning that those items that are part of the MMPI-3 were found to work psychometrically both in English and in Spanish. That was a very critical step in the development process. In terms of the outcome of the development, we wound up with 5 new scales, 1 new validity scale, combined response inconsistency, and then 4 specific problem scales. The labels are fairly self-explanatory: eating concerns, compulsivity, impulsivity, and self-importance. That's the scale that focuses on grandiosity. We also made some substantial modifications to some of the MMPI-2RF scales. The anxiety scale was substantially expanded and now is called anxiety-related experiences. The stress and worry scale was divided into 2 separate measures of stress and worry. And the interpersonal passivity scale was reverse keyed, so that higher scores now help us identify individuals who are very domineering and overbearing in interpersonal relationships, and the scale was renamed dominance. We did drop some items in order to make, and some scales in order to make room for some of the new items that were added to the MMPI-3. So we no longer have separate measures of gastrointestinal and head pain complaints, although we did keep some of those items on RC1, the somatic complaint scale. And then we dropped the multiple specific fears and aesthetic, literary, and mechanical physical interests. And again, that was in order to make room for some of the new item content for the MMPI-3. The outcome of all of this is that we wound up adding 72 new items for the MMPI-3, dropping 75 MMPI-2RF items, for a total of 335 items on the MMPI-3. And you can see the breakdown here. 220 of those are original MMPI items, 43 are items that were written for the MMPI-2, and then 72 of the 335 are items that were newly written for the MMPI-3. In English, the reading level for the MMPI-3 remains the same as it was for the restructured form, a grade 4.5 on the Flesch-Kincaid readability index. We have a total of 52 scales on the MMPI-3. We don't have time in today's webinar to go into detailed descriptions, but those are available, of course, in the various sources that we'll be talking about here shortly. In fact, the sources that are available include our manual for administration, scoring, and interpretation, as well as a technical manual that provides extensive validation information for the MMPI-3. And then we have a user's guide for the score and clinical interpretive reports. Those are the software-based reports that are available for the instrument. Our focus today, of course, is on the Spanish translation of the MMPI-3, and this is a manual supplement that's available that Tony co-wrote with Alka Tulligan and myself, the authors of the MMPI-3. And this Spanish manual supplement for the Spanish language instrument provides a lot of information about the process that was followed in developing the Spanish language translation and the norms, and some psychometric data that I'll be highlighting here shortly. But before we do that, I'm going to turn things back over to Tony, who's going to walk us through the process that he and his team followed in translating the rewritten and new items for the MMPI-3.
One of the challenges of anything of this nature is the difficulty in making sure that you develop a team that understands the variety of Spanish that's spoken in the United States. I wish it was as simple as we just need Spanish, but there are different demographic groups that represent the entire Hispanic subculture, and we wanted to make sure that that group was attended to. So first of all, let me tell you a little bit about the team that was put together. That was led by myself, who happens to be a Cuban American. My native language is Spanish, but my technical language is English. Then we had a Mexican American graduate student born in the United States that was involved in the original translation along with myself. Then we had someone that was a prior undergraduate student who pursued the PhD in Spain with one of my former students, who in turn was involved with the back translation. She was residing in Spain, spent some time in the US to help us achieve this particular task. And then we had an American professor of linguistics whose focus was totally in Spanish, and her particular task was analysis of the original and back translation from a linguistic and, if you will, cultural perspective. And then when we finally got all of this together, we had a Mexican American who allowed us the opportunity to do some beta testing to make sure that our items not only made sense to us, even though we went through this very complex analysis that I'll share with you, but that it actually made sense to the people that might be using this. So here's the actual method for translating and adapting. Remember, we just didn't translate it, we adapted. And remember, we didn't do just linguistic, we did cultural interpretations as well, making sure that we did not modify the construct, and that our focus was that we would simply adapt the construct from English to Spanish, and again, from Spanish back to English. So the first thing that we did is we sat down as a group, all of us, and came up with what is the construct that we were trying to measure with each of the specific items. Then two of us were tasked to translate the item from English to Spanish. And as much as possible, our goal was to translate it into what we refer to as Pan-Spanish, not Cuban Spanish or Mexican Spanish, just Pan-Spanish. As much as possible, words and concepts that were equally understandable by all members of the demographics that we call Spanish speakers in the US. And then independently, that activity was then back translated item to item from Spanish to English. And then we all sat down one more time and negotiated that indeed, one, was the construct still intact? And two, was the fidelity of the English translation captured in the way that we had come up with the final set of words and the final paraphrasing and phrasing of the item themselves? And then we reviewed the final item in the context of all remaining items. And this was surprisingly a difficult task. We want to make sure that we use the same kinds of verbs, same kinds of nouns, the same phraseology. So we didn't have a particular bias to one kind of a statement versus another. And then we took those items and we did some beta testing in the field to make sure that it made sense. When it was all said and done, that all the psychometric wrangling that we had been involved in, that actually made sense to the people that were actually going to take the test. And with that, let me turn it back to Yossi, who's going to talk about the norms and the psychometric findings.
Thank you, Tony. And so that then was our starting point for the collection of data, including the normative data. And I'll talk a little bit about the normative data collection process itself. So the University of Minnesota Press, the publisher, hired an outside firm, a company by the name of Eureka Facts, to do the actual normative data collection throughout the United States. This company was selected because of their particular expertise in reaching populations that are more difficult to recruit for research projects. And in particular, they had a lot of experience working with and identifying individuals of Hispanic origin, as well as Spanish speakers in the U.S. They had done some previous projects in collecting information and data from Spanish-speaking individuals in the United States, including undocumented individuals, which we certainly did not want to exclude from our data collection. So the normative data collection happened beginning in September 2017 through December of 2018. And what Eureka Facts did was to go from community to community and recruit through a number of different media, including social media, ads in newspapers, but also importantly, word of mouth, individuals to potentially participate in the study. The first thing they did, anyone interested did then, was to call into Eureka Facts and get screened by phone in order to make sure that they met our various demographic and language targets. And so thousands of individuals were screened by phone. And then, as we just saw, over 3,000 individuals actually were tested. And all of the testing was done in prearranged locations. So people came into these prearranged locations at the various cities and sites. Each individual was paid $50 per session. So those who came back for retesting were paid another $50. Almost all of the testing was done by computer, both in English and in Spanish. And one of the advantages of this was that the data were then available to the development team in real time. We were able to actually follow the data as they were being collected throughout the U.S. What I'm focusing on here, we cover the English language norms and other trainings, but our focus, of course, today is on the Spanish language translation and norms. So this slide indicates where the Spanish-speaking Spanish language normative data were collected. You can see that the sites included Washington, D.C., San Diego, Dallas, and Miami, for a total of 550 individuals included in the final Spanish language normative sample, 275 men and 275 women. The individuals in this sample were asked about their ethnic origins, and not surprisingly, the vast majority identified themselves as Hispanic or mixed race. In terms of ancestral origins reported by the participants in our Spanish language normative sample, you see the breakdown here in this slide. And of course, people could and did report more than one ancestral origin, depending upon the ancestral origins of their parents. But all of the individuals were tested in the United States. Here we see the age distribution, a smaller proportion of individuals in the older age band, and that's not uncommon. We also wind up testing fewer people, or have at least in the past, in that age band. And in terms of education levels, a fairly equal distribution among the four educational groups as that we used in identifying education levels for the normative sample. The next set of slides we're going to take a look at now plot the scores of the Spanish language normative sample on the English language norms. So if, for example, there were no differences at all between the scores of the two normative samples, what we would then expect to find is a mean of 50 and a standard deviation of 10 for the Spanish language normative sample when scored with the English language norms. To the extent that the mean scores deviate from 50, that represents a difference between the two normative samples, the English language and the Spanish language normative sample. So we can see, for example, here that the mean score for the Spanish language normative sample, both the men and the women, is just over half a standard deviation above the English language mean, which would be 50. So we have a higher score on FP, and we have an even higher mean scores for both the men and the women on L. For the Spanish language normative sample, this is not at all uncommon. We see that with other translations of the MMPI instruments, particularly Spanish language translations in the past. And of course, once we switch to and score an individual's protocol who's been tested in Spanish using the Spanish language norms, then that difference is accounted for, and we'll wind up with a mean of 50 and a standard deviation of 10 for the normative sample, the Spanish language normative sample. We do also see somewhat larger standard deviation of 12 here on the L scale for the Spanish language sample. In terms of the substantive scales, you'll note that the Spanish language normative sample scores lower on the higher order behavioral externalizing dysfunction scale. We see that on several of the other externalizing scales, as I'll summarize here in a moment. We see that the Spanish language normative sample scores below average on the malaise scale and above average, substantially above average on the behavior restricting fears scale of the MMPI-3. On the externalizing scales in general, we don't see substantial differences except for juvenile conduct problems. And the same is true on the interpersonal scales of the MMPI-3. We do see a substantially below average score on the disconstraint scale for the Spanish language normative sample. So overall, what we find is that most of the mean scores fall within 5 T-score points of the English language normative sample, with some noteworthy exceptions that I highlighted as we went through the slides. What we see also is somewhat reduced variability on some of the substantive scales. And the bottom line is that indeed separate Spanish language norms are necessary and available for the MMPI-3. In terms of some of the psychometric data that you'll find in the Spanish language translation manual supplement, we, of course, report reliability data. These are test, retest, and internal consistency data, along with standard errors of measurement, which are very important. In fact, what this slide shows is a summary of the standard errors of measurement across the various sets of scales of the MMPI-3, and you can see that by and large, these standard errors fall in the 5 to 6 T-score point range, and they are in fact quite similar, and that's what we see here for the English language normative sample, is that the standard errors of measurement for the two versions of the test, the English and Spanish language versions of the MMPI-3, standard errors of measurement are quite comparable across versions, telling us that we have similar levels of measurement precision for the Spanish and English language translations. These are some data comparing the bilingual test-retest findings. So people were tested both in English and in Spanish for our bilingual samples. Some were tested first in English and second in Spanish, and vice versa. These are compared with the test-retest findings for the Spanish and English language version of the test for people who were tested twice in the same language. And generally speaking, what we find is very comparable results, indicating that we're getting similar information from the Spanish and English language translations, which, of course, the importance of which Tony highlighted in some of his earlier remarks. And then finally, we have some information about the validity, of course, of the Spanish language translation. These are some data that were collected in one of our college student sample, a sample that was collected in Texas of Spanish-speaking college students who completed the MMPI-3, along with the personality inventory for the DSM-5, the PID-5, both in Spanish. And I've highlighted just some of the findings here. You can see, for example, that the RC7 scores are correlated with negative affect and anxiousness, as we would expect them to be. Demoralization and RC2 are substantially correlated with the detachment domain of the PID-5, which is a measure of the alternative model of personality disorders in the DSM-5, and in particular correlated with anhedonia, which again is what RC2 we would expect to be associated with, and demoralization with depressivity. We see that for the antagonism domain, we don't have the antagonism-focused scales here in this slide. Those are some of the specific problem scales. But for the disinhibition domain, we see correlations between RC9 in particular, as we would expect, and distractibility and impulsivity, as well as RC4 and irresponsibility. And then in the psychoticism domain, we find the correlations that we would expect here with RC8, the aberrant experiences scale. So the validity findings in the manual supplement, the Spanish language manual supplement, very much support the validity. This is just a small subset of the findings of our scores for the Spanish language translation of the MMPI-3. With that, I'm going to then turn things back to Tony to talk about some best practices for using the Spanish language translation of the MMPI-3 with Spanish speakers in the United States.
So the question now becomes, with all of this information, how do we make this work on a day-to-day basis? How do we take this new test and administer it to individuals in order to get some useful clinical information? So what we're going to discuss here for the next few minutes are some best practices that in our own clinical setting, as well as when we were trying to figure out whether our version worked with the folks that we were working with, did that make sense? Here's some of the things that we found that we want to share with you. First of all, people who speak Spanish and come from this particular background really need a little bit more rapport building. Just don't put the test in front of them, say, here are the instructions, finish it up. When you're finished, let us know. It's not that simple. We have to sit down, establish rapport, make sense of what's going on, and make sure, as I'll say in a minute, that they understand why they're doing this. There's a lot of distrust among this population with individuals that are psychologists that don't understand what we do, what's the purpose of all this. So you may take a little bit more time making sure that they understand the purpose of the evaluation and specifically what the test is all about and the instructions. Sometimes you simply have to describe beyond the instructions that are provided and deconstruct things in a way that makes real simple sense. Maybe going through each of the first few items, making sure they understand exactly how this is to work. For many, the idea of taking the test on a computer is very foreign to them. So you may even have to go through the process of simply explaining how to run the computer. One of the challenges that we have is that despite the fact that many individuals or Spanish speakers are monolinguals, an increasing number of them happen to be bilinguals. Then the question becomes, which version of the MMPI do you administer? Do you administer the English version or the Spanish version? So you may want to take a few moments, if not before even starting the test, to assess the concept of what is their primary language. So for example, in my own case, I may be able to speak Spanish than I do English, but technically speaking, I'm much better in English than I am in Spanish. So which version of the test should I be given? Might you want to consider taking a moment and doing an assessment of their reading ability using something like one of the Woodcock products or some variation of the theme, finding out which language they're strongest in? Because after all, that's the language that you want to consider. Make sure that when you finish all of this, that the bottom line is that they understand why they're there, they understand the concept of the test, and more importantly, that they understand the instructions. If that's the case, then I think you're ready to go. You may want to, unlike what sometimes we think about with our English clients, you may want to take a moment to make sure that once they start the test, that they continue the test and realize that time is something that is not as important to us as to the individuals that we're used to spending time with. So if that's the case, give a little bit more time. Even though the MMPI-3 is a short version relative to what we're used to with the MMPI-2 and the 2RF, it could be that they may take a little bit longer. Be patient. This is not a group of individuals that we could push hard and fast to get good data. It's important that rapport, instructions, and process be understood and adhered to as much as possible. All right, let's hope that when it's all said and done. We get some good data. Then how do we turn that data into practice? In other words, we spent a few minutes with you today sharing with wonderful information about how this exciting new MMPI has been developed and the fact that it looks very promising. But at the same time, how do we work the numbers into reality? So here's an idea. Make sure the validity scores are fine. We have some new products in here, so you may have to get yourself a little bit more acquainted. But once that's done, make sure that we have a valid test. And then, of course, if it's not valid, ask the question, at least from a clinical perspective, why that may not be. It could be that they simply are wary of the entire process. So explain it to them at the very beginning, make sure we get good data at the end. And make sure that the clinical findings that you got from the interview, from record review, somehow or the other match what you're getting with the actual scores on the MMPI-3. Then consider a different approach. Instead of just getting the data and seeing what the printout looks like to you or what the numbers show up in the scales, put it in what I call a Russian social historical perspective. Put the data, all those wonderful numbers you'll get, within a biopsychosocial context so it makes sense. In other words, maybe more so than what we're used to with an American samples. Please make sure that the data that you get from the MMPI-3 makes sense inside a complex social cultural context. This is very much in the Luria-Vygotsky approach. So, in essence, begin with a quantitative psychometric approach that we're also used to, but if at all possible, end with a qualitative social historical approach so the data makes sense inside a complex contextual situation that maybe we're not so used to in psychometrics. All right, here we are. We've come to the end of our time together today. And let me provide some commentary before I turn it back to Yossi, and he could say a last couple of words for us. First of all, as far as we know, this is the first simultaneous translation, and as we have explained today, adaptation, not just translation, adaptation. We have not modified the test. We have accommodated the test of a major psychological instrument. In the history of the 5,000 instruments that are out there, this is the first time we believe that this has been shared with this community. There's a strong adaptive methodology. I like to say that we're not OCD, but in all honesty, we came close to it. You saw all the steps that we've taken, not only in the translation, but in the administration of the test, the number of individuals, how we recruited them, and so forth, so on. And the excellent psychometric qualities. We really have a quality instrument that looks like both versions are essentially equivalent. Maybe not exactly the same, but very close, enough to call it equivalent. Obviously, additional research is necessary and is ongoing. We look forward not only to you using it, but also sharing with us your ideas and maybe collaborating so we make sure that this instrument grows with us and our knowledge. And as always, we gave you some best practices, but we look forward to, in the future, sharing new information as we get more data as to how we make this instrument the best instruments available to make sure we understand individuals who are Spanish speakers that are in need of being able to be understood from the perspective of an MMPI. Yossi.
Thank you, Tony. And just to, I just want to pick up and reiterate one of the points that Tony just made, and that is regarding the additional research that is ongoing. We're involved with some of that research, data collection, both in the community and also in some mental health settings. And it's truly been one of the hallmarks of the MMPI instruments throughout the history of the test, that it's not a static instrument. It's an ongoing development process, and we learn more about the test as we continue to do research and, of course, use it clinically and use the research to inform practice and, importantly, the practice to inform research. And so in that context, I would very much like to invite those of you who wind up using the MMPI-3 to let us know if you have data that are available, that you would like to collaborate with us on any research with the Spanish language translation of the instrument. Please also share your experiences with us in terms of the actual use of the tests with Spanish speakers. The very first slide in today's presentation includes our email addresses, and both Tony and I are pretty easy to find in terms of finding our contact information. So we'd very much like to invite you to share your experiences. Let us know if you have an interest in doing collaborating with research, and look forward to hearing from you. And with that, we'll thank you very much for your attention today.
Gracias.
Muchas gracias.